My neighbor quit his six-figure corporate job to follow his dream of opening a craft brewery. He had passion, savings, and a detailed business plan. Within 18 months, he had lost everything: his savings, his home, and nearly his marriage. Today, I'm going to tell you his story, break down exactly what went wrong, and show you the harsh truths about entrepreneurship that motivational Instagram posts will never tell you. Because sometimes the dream isn't worth the risk. Let me introduce you to my neighbor. We'll call him Mark to protect his privacy. Mark was 38 years old, working as a senior project manager at a Fortune 500 company, earning around $120,000 a year with excellent benefits. He had a wife, 2 young kids, a mortgage on a nice suburban home, and from the outside, he had exactly what most people would consider a successful life. But Mark wasn't happy. He felt unfulfilled, trapped in corporate meetings and PowerPoint presentations. His real passion was craft beer. He'd been homebrewing for years, won some local competitions, and dreamed of opening his own brewery. He spent hours researching the craft beer industry, watching brewery tours on YouTube, and imagining himself as the owner of a thriving local taproom. So one day, after years of dreaming and months of planning, Mark did what all the motivational speakers tell you to do. He bet on himself. He quit his job, cashed out his retirement accounts, took out a second mortgage on his house, and poured everything into his dream. And it destroyed him. This is the story nobody wants to tell you about following your passion. Mark's vision was beautiful. He imagined a cozy neighborhood brewery with exposed brick walls, reclaimed wood tables, and locals gathering to enjoy his carefully crafted IPAs and stouts. He pictured himself as not just a business owner, but as a pillar of the community, creating a space where people connected over great beer. He saw himself on local news segments, at beer festivals, collaborating with other brewers. It was intoxicating. But here's what Mark didn't fully understand. Loving craft beer and being good at homebrewing has almost nothing to do with successfully running a brewery business. Running a brewery means dealing with suppliers, managing inventory, navigating complex alcohol licensing regulations, hiring and managing staff, maintaining expensive equipment, handling payroll and taxes, marketing and promoting your business, managing cash flow, and 1,000 other operational details that have nothing to do with brewing great beer. Mark spent probably 80% of his time on business operations and only 20% actually brewing or developing recipes. The thing he was passionate about, the craft of brewing, became the smallest part of his daily reality. Instead, he was drowning in invoices, arguing with contractors about delayed equipment installations, dealing with employee no-shows, and lying awake at night worried about whether he could make next month's rent on the building. This is the fundamental disconnect that destroys so many dreamers. They fall in love with their idea of what something will be like, not the reality of what it actually involves. Mark loved beer, not business management. But opening a brewery required him to become primarily a business person, not a brewer. And he wasn't prepared for that harsh reality. The Instagram posts and motivational videos never mention this part. They show the highlight reel, not the unglamorous grind that makes up 90% of entrepreneurship. Let me break down exactly how Mark's financial situation unraveled, because the numbers tell a devastating story. Mark started with approximately $180,000 in startup capital. He had $80,000 from cashing out his 401k, which after taxes and early withdrawal penalties actually only gave him about $55,000. He took out a $100,000 second mortgage on his house, which he planned to pay back once the brewery became profitable. And he had about $25,000 in personal savings that he and his wife had accumulated over years. Now, here's the problem. Starting a brewery is incredibly capital intensive. The brewing equipment alone cost him $85,000. The build-out of the space, plumbing, electrical, flooring, the taproom furniture and bar, cost another $60,000. Licensing, permits, and legal fees were $15,000. Initial inventory of ingredients, glassware, kegs, and supplies was $12,000. He was already at $172,000 before he even opened the doors. That left him only $8,000 for operating expenses, marketing, and his own living expenses while the business ramped up. This was his first catastrophic mistake, drastically underestimating how much runway he needed. Industry experts recommend having at least 12 to 18 months of operating expenses saved before starting a restaurant or brewery, because it takes that long to build a customer base and achieve consistent profitability. Mark had enough money for maybe 2 months. When the brewery opened, sales were disappointing. He projected $40,000 in revenue the first month based on his market research and optimistic calculations. He actually did $11,000. The second month was a bit better at $16,000, but his monthly operating expenses, rent, utilities, ingredients, staff wages, loan payments, were running around $28,000. He was losing $12,000 to $17,000 every single month. Mark did what desperate entrepreneurs do. He started putting expenses on credit cards. He maxed out 3 cards totaling $45,000 in credit limits. He borrowed $20,000 from his parents, promising to pay them back within a year. He delayed paying suppliers, which damaged his relationships and credit. He cut staff to the bone, which meant he and his wife were working 80-hour weeks trying to keep the place running. The stress was destroying his health and his marriage. By month 12, Mark was over $200,000 in debt beyond his original investment. The brewery was barely generating enough revenue to cover basic operating expenses, let alone make a dent in the debt. His credit cards were maxed out at 22% interest. He had stopped making payments on the second mortgage, and the bank was sending foreclosure notices. His parents were calling asking about the money he owed them. And he was still losing money every single month with no clear path to profitability. By month 18 it was over. Mark closed the brewery, laid off his small staff, and filed for bankruptcy. The equipment was sold at auction for pennies on the dollar. He and his wife lost their home to foreclosure. They had to move into a small apartment and start completely over financially. At 40 years old, Mark had negative net worth and was back to sending out resumes for corporate jobs he had confidently quit just 18 months earlier. But the financial devastation was only part of the story. The emotional and relational damage was arguably worse and will take far longer to heal. Mark's wife had been supportive of his dream initially, but as the reality set in, their relationship deteriorated rapidly. They fought constantly about money. She had warned him early on that they were burning through cash too quickly, that they needed to cut their losses and close down before it got worse. But Mark kept insisting they just needed a few more months, that he could turn it around, that success was just around the corner. His optimism and refusal to face reality became a source of bitter resentment. His wife had to go back to work full-time despite having planned to stay home with their young children for a few more years. They had to pull their kids out of the private school they attended and enroll them in public school. They couldn't afford family vacations, eating out, or even small luxuries they'd previously taken for granted. The stress of poverty after years of comfortable middle-class life was crushing. Mark himself went into a deep depression. He had staked not just his money but his entire identity on this venture. He had announced to everyone, friends, family, former colleagues, that he was following his dream, that he was done with corporate life, that he was going to build something meaningful. The failure felt like a fundamental indictment of who he was as a person. He had to admit to everyone that he had failed spectacularly, that he had made terrible decisions that cost his family dearly. The shame was overwhelming. He stopped going to neighborhood gatherings because he couldn't face the questions and the pity. He avoided old friends because he was embarrassed. His mental health suffered. He gained weight, started drinking more than he should, and struggled with anxiety and insomnia. His marriage barely survived, and only because his wife, despite her anger and frustration, recognized that he was suffering and needed support rather than abandonment. This is what following your dream can actually look like when it goes wrong. Not a noble failure that builds character and leads to a comeback story. Just real, grinding, devastating consequences that affect you and everyone who depends on you. Mark didn't emerge from this experience more resilient or enlightened. He emerged broken, traumatized, and deeply regretful about decisions he can never undo. So what went wrong? Let me break down Mark's specific mistakes, because understanding them might save someone else from the same fate. First and most fundamental, Mark confused passion with business viability. He loved craft beer, but that didn't mean there was sustainable demand for yet another brewery in a market that was already becoming saturated. By the time Mark opened his brewery, there were already 4 other craft breweries within a 5-mile radius, plus dozens of bars and restaurants serving craft beer on tap. He was entering a crowded market with no significant differentiation. His beer was good, but it wasn't notably better than the competition. He needed a compelling reason for customers to choose his brewery over established alternatives, and because I'm passionate about it, isn't enough. Second, Mark drastically underestimated startup costs and overestimated revenues. This is incredibly common among first-time entrepreneurs. He did some research and created spreadsheets, but his numbers were based on best-case scenarios and optimistic assumptions. He didn't build an adequate buffer for unexpected expenses, and there are always unexpected expenses. Equipment breaks down, build-outs take longer than planned and cost more than quoted, initial marketing doesn't work as well as hoped, and revenue takes longer to ramp up than projections suggest. Mark needed probably $300,000 to $400,000 to do this safely, not $180,000. Third, Mark had no relevant business experience. He'd been a project manager, which involves some useful skills, but he'd never run a business, never managed a P&L, never dealt with the operational realities of a customer-facing retail operation. He was learning everything on the fly while simultaneously trying to keep a struggling business afloat. That's extraordinarily difficult. If he'd spent a few years actually working at a brewery first, learning the business from the inside, understanding the economics and operations, he would have either realized it wasn't for him or been far better prepared to succeed. Fourth, Mark didn't test his concept with minimal investment before going all in. He could have started by selling his beer at farmers markets, local bars, or through a contract brewing arrangement. He could have validated that there was actual demand for his product and built a customer base before investing everything in a physical location. Instead, he made the classic mistake of building it and assuming they would come. They didn't come in sufficient numbers. Fifth, Mark didn't have a realistic exit strategy or safety net. When things started going wrong, he should have cut his losses at month 6 or 8, closed the brewery, sold the equipment while it still had value, and minimized the damage. But he kept pouring money into a failing venture because he was emotionally invested, because he couldn't admit failure, because he kept believing the turnaround was coming. This is called the sunk cost fallacy, continuing to invest in something because you've already invested so much, even when the rational decision is to walk away. And finally, Mark risked money he couldn't afford to lose. He used retirement savings, home equity, and borrowed money from family. These weren't risk capital. These were the financial foundations of his family's security. When you're starting a business, you should only risk money that, if you lose it completely, won't destroy your life. Mark violated this fundamental principle and paid the price. Here's what Mark should have done if he truly wanted to pursue his brewery dream while protecting his family and financial security. First, he should have kept his corporate job and started brewing on the side. Yes, it would have been exhausting working full-time and building a business on nights and weekends. Yes, it would have taken longer. But it also would have been dramatically safer. He could have tested his business concept, built a customer base, and validated demand before risking everything. He could have started with a much smaller vision, maybe a nano brewery operation out of a small industrial space, producing small batches and distributing to local bars and bottle shops. Initial investment, maybe $30,000 to $50,000 instead of $180,000. Monthly operating expenses, maybe $5,000 instead of $28,000. Much more manageable, much less risky. He should have worked at an established brewery for a year or two, learning the business from the inside. This would have given him realistic insight into profit margins, operational challenges, and whether this was actually something he wanted to do full-time. Many people discover that their hobby becomes less enjoyable when it's their job and source of stress. He absolutely should have kept at least 1 year of living expenses and savings that he never touched for the business. This would have given him a safety net if things went wrong. Instead, he invested every dollar he had and then some, leaving no room for error. He should have sought experienced advisors and mentors, people who had actually run successful breweries or similar businesses. Someone with experience would have looked at his financial projections and immediately identified the red flags. Mark was operating in an echo chamber of his own optimism, surrounded by friends and family who supported his dream but had no expertise to offer useful guidance. And perhaps most importantly, he should have been honest with himself about whether he wanted to be a brewer or a business owner. If what he truly loved was the craft of brewing, he could have pursued that as a serious hobby, entered competitions, maybe brewed commercially for someone else's brewery. He didn't need to risk everything to engage with his passion. The all-or-nothing approach is often the wrong approach. There's a smarter path to entrepreneurship that doesn't involve burning your life to the ground. Start small, test your assumptions, build gradually, keep your safety net intact, and only go full-time when you've validated that your business can sustain you financially. It's less dramatic than the "I quit my job to follow my dream" narrative, but it's also far less likely to end in devastating failure. Here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody wants to hear. Sometimes you shouldn't follow your dreams. Sometimes the responsible, mature, correct decision is to keep your stable job, enjoy your passion as a hobby, and be grateful for the financial security that allows you to have a comfortable life. Our culture has this toxic relationship with entrepreneurship and following your passion. We celebrate people who quit their jobs to pursue their dreams. We share inspirational quotes about taking risks and betting on yourself. We tell stories about successful entrepreneurs who defied the odds. But we conveniently ignore the vastly larger number of people who tried, failed, and suffered devastating consequences. For every success story you hear about someone who quit their corporate job and built a thriving business, there are 100 or 1,000 stories like Mark's. People who lost their savings, their homes, their marriages, and years of their lives chasing a dream that never materialized. We don't hear those stories because they're not inspirational. They don't get shared on social media or featured in business magazines. But they're far more common than the success stories. The reality is that most businesses fail. Depending on the study, somewhere between 50% and 90% of new businesses fail within the first 5 years. The odds are against you, especially if you're entering a competitive industry with high startup costs and low margins, like restaurants, breweries, or retail. Those are some of the hardest businesses to succeed in, yet people keep starting them because they're passionate about food or beer or fashion. Passion is not a business strategy. Passion doesn't pay bills or generate revenue. Passion doesn't make your product better than established competitors. Passion can actually be dangerous because it clouds your judgment and makes you take irrational risks that you'd never take if you were thinking purely in terms of business logic. Sometimes the right answer is to appreciate what you have. Mark had a good job, financial security, a comfortable home, a healthy family. He threw all of that away chasing something that felt more meaningful but turned out to be a nightmare. In retrospect, he would give anything to have that boring corporate job back. The grass isn't always greener. Sometimes it's just different grass with different problems, and the problems you had before were actually quite manageable by comparison. It's been 3 years since Mark closed his brewery. He eventually found another corporate project management job, but at a lower salary than before, about $85,000 instead of $120,000. The gap in his resume and the bankruptcy on his record made it harder to land a good position. He and his wife are still rebuilding financially. They're renting a modest apartment and will be for years. Their credit is too damaged to qualify for a mortgage, and they have no down payment anyway. They're making payments on a debt consolidation plan that will take 7 more years to complete. They've had to delay retirement savings to deal with current financial obligations. Financially, they're probably 15 years behind where they would have been if Mark had just kept his corporate job. His relationship with his wife survived, but it's changed. There's a lingering resentment and loss of trust that may never fully heal. She supported his dream and it cost their family dearly. She's more cautious now, more anxious about money, less willing to take any risks. That's understandable, but it's sad. Mark himself is deeply regretful. He doesn't talk about the brewery anymore. He doesn't homebrew anymore. It reminds him of everything he lost. He's more cynical about entrepreneurship and suspicious of people who talk about following your passion. The experience fundamentally changed him, and not in the positive, character-building way that motivational speakers promise. Would he do it differently if he could go back? Absolutely. He would either pursue it much more cautiously, keeping his job, starting smaller, testing the concept first, or he wouldn't pursue it at all. The all-or-nothing approach destroyed his life, and he's living with those consequences every single day. If you're watching this and you're considering quitting your job to follow your dream, I'm not telling you not to do it. What I'm telling you is to be smart about it. Be realistic about the risks. Don't confuse passion with business viability. Don't risk money you can't afford to lose. Don't burn your life to the ground for a dream that might be a nightmare in disguise. Test your concept first. Start small. Keep your safety net. Get real experience. Consult with experts. Have a clear exit strategy. And be honest with yourself about whether entrepreneurship is really what you want or if you're just unhappy with your current situation. Sometimes the right move is to improve your current job situation, find a better employer, or pursue your passion as a serious hobby while keeping your financial stability intact. That's not giving up on your dreams. That's being a mature, responsible adult who makes decisions based on reality rather than fantasy. Share this video with someone who's thinking about taking a big entrepreneurial leap. Sometimes people need to hear the cautionary tales, not just the success stories. Reality exists between the extremes of never take any risks and bet everything on your dream. Find that middle path. Mark's story didn't have to end this way. If he'd been more cautious, more realistic, more strategic, he might have still pursued his brewery dream successfully, or he might have discovered it wasn't viable before losing everything. Either outcome would have been better than what actually happened. Your dreams are valuable, but so is your financial security, your family's well-being, and your mental health. Don't sacrifice everything for a fantasy. Be smart, be strategic, and protect what you already have while pursuing what you want. If you found this video valuable, subscribe for more realistic perspectives on entrepreneurship and personal finance. Remember, not every dream is worth the risk. and there's no shame in choosing stability over uncertainty. Thanks for watching and make your decisions wisely.